Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to go over all of the books that I read in the month of December. The month of December totally flew by. I cannot believe it is almost 2019. I don't usually film my wrap-ups until the month is over, but today's the 30th and I have just barely started 2 books, so there's no way I'm going to finish either of them. So I feel pretty safe making this video. Sadly, this wrap-up is not vlog style. Like I said, the month flew by for me, and by the time I realized I hadn't filmed any clips for my wrap-up, it was already like almost Christmas, and I figured I would just wait till the end of the month and do just a normal wrap-up this month. That probably ended up being a good thing because I finished 6 books this month, and if I was doing this wrap-up vlog style, I think that video would be like 30 minutes long. One of the books I did finish on like December 2nd, so I read most of it in November, but I was still really impressed with the number of books that I read this month. Like I said, I read 6 books, and out of those 6 books, only one of them was 3 stars. I had 4 4-star books and 1 5-star book. Out of these 6, 3 of the books were standalones and 3 were books in a series, none of which were series starters, so yay, I didn't start any series this month, and one of them actually was a series ender, so yay, I finished a series. I'm going to be talking about these books in the order that I read them. So the very first book that I finished in December, which, like I said, I finished on December 2nd, was New Spring, which was our What-Along or Wheel of Time read-along book for November, and I gave New Spring 4 out of 5 stars. I read New Spring in both audiobook and ebook formats, both of which I own. This book served as a nice little palate cleanser as far as the Wheel of Time series, because as of right now, I've read up to book 10, and the last 3 or so books have been on the slower side. It's the sloggy middle of the series that I knew we were coming to. Reading this novella was a nice little refresher, and it definitely got me re-excited about diving back into the series. For those of you who don't know, this is a prequel novella, and it has only 2 point of views. Those are of Moraine and Lan, which are 2 of my favorite characters, so I really enjoyed getting back into their head and seeing into their pasts. I'm really glad that I read this after having read the first 10 books. I read it in publication order, but technically you could read this book, I think, anytime after book 6 without any spoilers, but I personally like reading things in publication order, so that's what we did for the read-along. And I'm glad that I did because there are a lot of Aes Sedai that are in this book, and a lot of them you've only met in books like 6 through 10, so I was really glad to have had that perspective before reading this book so that I had a better idea of who those Aes Sedai characters were. And it was just really interesting to see the relationships these Aes Sedai had back before the main Wheel of Time series started. I also really enjoyed getting to know Lan's culture a little bit better, the Malkiri culture. I mean, we read a little bit about it in the main series, but you get a little more insight into Lan's past and the culture of the Malkir in this book. So this was actually my first time to read New Spring. I wasn't sure if I had read it before. Now that I have actually read it, I knew as I was reading it that this was the first time I was coming across this story. So that was another thing that was refreshing about a Wheel of Time book, is that this was finally one that I was completely fresh to. Although pretty soon I'm going to be reading more Wheel of Time books for the first time. As much as I enjoyed this book, I ended up giving it a 4-star rating, mostly because it just wasn't as epic as the rest of the books. It is technically a novella set in this world, and just the scope of the story was smaller than what we get from the main series books, and because of that, it was just more of a 4-star read for me than a 5-star read. The next book that I finished in December was Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. I read this both in ebook and audiobook formats that I got from my library. I was reading this book because it was a TBR jar pick, and I was honestly a little hesitant going into it because I have already seen the movie, and so I thought that this book really wouldn't work for me as a thriller because I would know so much about it. And that did prove to be a little bit true, but it had been so long since I watched the movie that there were still a few surprises for me. At first I was actually pretty skeptical about it because there were a couple of writing things that I noticed that I wasn't really liking. One of those things was an overuse of parentheses. I swear at the beginning of the book, especially in the husband's point of view, he was using a lot of parentheses and it was driving me a little bit insane. And then from the wife's point of view, she was supposed to be a quiz writer for like a magazine. So in her diary entries, she would leave these little quizzes, and I was not liking that. But the good thing is both of those things didn't last throughout the whole novel, and so I was able to look past that in the end. Gone Girl is an adult thriller that has some darker themes, although it wasn't quite as dark as what I thought it might be based on how people talk about it. I don't know. I think I need to readjust like what I consider to be dark, because a lot of times people will say, oh, this book was so dark, and I'll read it and be like, yeah, that was pretty dark, but like it just isn't what I have built up in my head, so maybe I need to reel that back in a little bit. Anyways, I'm sure you have heard of Gone Girl before, because not only is it a really famous book, but it was also made into a movie. But it's about this couple. The wife one day goes missing, and of course the husband is the main suspect, and it's just a mystery figuring out what happened to the wife. But really it only takes about halfway through the book to figure out what happened to the wife, which actually surprised me. I didn't realize there was going to be so much happening after that point, but that's more of the midpoint. And then other stuff happens that I can't really talk about because it would ruin the midpoint. I'm glad that I waited to read this for so long after watching the movie, because so many of the details were fuzzy. I really couldn't tell you what things were the same or different in the movie. I just remembered like what the big twist was, and so everything else in the book still surprised me, and that helped me to enjoy it more, although it still wasn't quite a 5-star book. If you haven't seen the movie and you don't know what like the big twist is about this book, like you haven't been spoiled for it, then I definitely recommend it. I think that it would be a fun twist to be surprised for. If you have seen the movie, I'd say you could probably pass on the book, but if it's been a while and things are fuzzy, you might still have a good time reading it. At least that was my experience. The next book that I finished in December was The Final Descent by Rick Yancey, which I gave 3 out of 5 stars. I had a physical copy of this that I got out from my library. This is the last book in the Monstrumologist quartet, and I have been reading one of these books every year around Halloween time because they are middle grade / YA horror books. The series definitely starts out more middle grade. He's about 12 in that book, and then every year I think he gets older, so he's 16 in this one. And this book definitely felt much more YA. The main character, Will, is more emotional and angsty in this book compared to the other books. So this series is about the main character, Will. It's actually told through what's supposed to be journal entries. Like somebody has found Will's journal and is like reading through it. Will is the apprentice to a monstrumologist, which is like a PhD sort of doctor that studies monsters that are part of an underworld that not everybody believes is real. This series is definitely horror in the sense that a lot of like gross and disgusting things are described. I have really enjoyed the series. I think I gave all of the previous books 4 out of 5 stars, and sadly this last book was a bit of a disappointment. It was actually kind of interesting because at the beginning of the book there is an author's note. I guess that this last book almost didn't get published, but then fans of the series were really upset and they decided to write the last book. I think it was partially done on purpose, but Will's journal entries definitely get more erratic and hard to follow in this last book. Definitely spent a good amount of time being confused about what was happening, but also I felt like Will's characterization had changed, and while I feel like some of that was explained, it was just a bit jarring because I felt like this Will was so different from the other 3 books. But I also think that Rick Yancey was looking at it as this is the end of Will's story, and so it was kind of showing how he would have been later on, because you do get glimpses into Will's adult life as well. There's a lot of time jumping, which added to the confusing. Anyways, I liked this book, but it was not as good as the other ones. It was a bit of a disappointment. It didn't like ruin the series for me or anything. I'm still glad that I read the series. I just wish that maybe Rick Yancey had been given more time for this last book. It felt like a series ender that was slapped together because the series needed to end. It just didn't work for me, which was so sad. The next book that I finished in the month of December was Landline by Rainbow Rowell, and I read this in audiobook and ebook form, both which I got from my library. This was another book that I had pulled out of my TBR jar, and I knew that this book took place during Christmas, so I was like, oh, I need to read this in December because I'm never going to be in the mood to read it except in December. So I'm really glad that I got a chance to read this. Rainbow Rowell has been a little bit hit or miss for me. I really liked Fangirl, but I really disliked Carry On, which I know is sort of an unpopular opinion, and maybe I'll talk more about that someday. But I was still interested in trying her again, and out of her adult contemporaries, this one has always been the one to stand out to me, even though people say Attachments is better than Landline, but the magical realism aspect of Landline appealed to me. So if you haven't heard of Landline, it, like I said, takes place at Christmas time. It's about this couple, or mostly the wife in the couple. This Christmas, she stays in LA because she has like a work thing come up, while her family, her husband, and her 2 daughters go to Montana, Nebraska, I think it's Nebraska, to spend time with her in-laws' family, and so they spend Christmas apart. Their relationship has kind of been getting rocky over the past whatever years. While they are apart this Christmas, the main character, whose name is Georgie, calls her husband on her landline and somehow gets her husband from like 20 years ago when they first got engaged, or before they first got engaged. And so the rest of the story is like about her talking to her past husband and just about their relationship and about marriage. This book definitely wasn't like groundbreaking or anything like that, but it was a lot of fun to read, and I feel like I appreciated it a lot from like a relationship aspect, like as someone who is married. I mean, I have what I think is a really great marriage, but I can still recognize that marriage is hard and it takes work, and that it's really easy to get complacent in your day-to-day activities, and how that can eventually like lead to issues if you're not diligent about paying attention to your relationship, if that makes any sense. But that's kind of like what this book was about, and it's about the main character, Georgie, just rediscovering her love for her husband. It was a really touching and heartwarming story. I think this is a perfect Christmas read if you're looking for a contemporary with a little bit of romance. The next book that I finished in the month of December was The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson, which is the second book in the First Era Mistborn trilogy. And I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I mostly read it in physical form from my library, but I also did have an ebook copy, and I got the audiobook like the last day that I was reading it, and I did listen to some of the book, but mostly I read it in physical form. This book blew my mind at the end. The ending of this book was insane. Okay, so the Mistborn series is a adult high fantasy by Brandon Sanderson, super popular, and I'd be shocked if you said you had never heard of it. I read the first book in this series in January, February, like very early this year. I also gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It was fantastic. I actually think that this book might be better for me than even the first book. Book 2 did not have middle book syndrome at all. The ending just totally put the whole book on its head, and I feel like it changed so much about my perspective of this world, and I am dying to read the next book. I'm hoping it happens really soon. I finished The Well of Ascension after I'd already filmed my winter TBR, so I wasn't able to put the next book, Hero of Ages, on my TBR, so it might end up having to be one of those exceptions that I make. But the way that The Well of Ascension ended has me so excited to continue the series. Just everything is different. I feel like everything is different after the end of The Well of Ascension. Brandon Sanderson is such a genius. I absolutely loved it. I'm not even coherent. I don't know what else to say about it. Not only do I love the characters and the world in this series, but I adore the magic system. It is super complex to the point where if you ask me to explain it just off the top of my head, I probably couldn't, as far as like what specific metals do, but I love that it's a hard magic system. I love that it has rules, and even though I can't always remember all the rules in my head, when I read them on page, everything makes sense, and I just love this series. So if you like adult high fantasy, if you like the Wheel of Time series and you haven't read Brandon Sanderson, what are you doing? I say definitely read this series. I mean, I haven't read the last one, but I know it's not going to disappoint me. Alright, on to the last book that I finished in the month of December, and that was Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. I read this in both ebook and audiobook formats, which I got from my library. This was another TBR jar pick. but this book has been on my TBR like forever, so I was really glad for an excuse to finally read it. And to be honest, I'm a little bit disappointed with it because this book was on a lot of people's favorites lists over the past couple of years. I've heard so many amazing things about it, and even though I always try to lower my expectations than what I hear about books, it's still hard to go into something not expecting to like it when so many people have loved it. That being said, I still gave it 4 stars, although I will say this is more of a 3.5 rounded up to 4 stars. So Station 11 is a adult post-apocalyptic book. It's set in a world where this really contagious and deadly flu outbreak happened that killed 99.9% of the population. It's told in basically 2 different timelines. It's told from 20 years after the apocalypse has happened, and in that timeline the main characters are part of a traveling troupe of performers that do like plays and also musicians. But it's also told in a timeline around when the outbreak happened, and the characters that are in these timelines are connected in lots of different ways. And that's one of the things that I really liked about this book, is that you are seeing things from lots of different perspectives, and these people are all connected, kind of like 6 degrees of separation style, that you as the reader can kind of piece together how they're connected, but the characters themselves don't always meet all of the other characters or know how they're connected, if that makes sense. So I really liked that aspect of it, and because of that aspect, because all of these people were vaguely connected, I really felt like we were leading up to some spectacular, like meaningful ending, and the ending is what really fell flat for me. The ending wasn't terrible by any means, but it kind of just like dissipated. The ending is a little bit open-ended. There are questions that I thought were going to be answered that were not answered. It's just like you kind of get to know all of these characters, and then at the end they go on their separate ways, and like that's it. And I just thought that there was going to be something more to the ending, and that really disappointed me. So most of the book, I thought this was definitely a 4-star book, leaning to a 5-star book, just waiting for a spectacular ending to happen, and then that ending didn't happen. I was really unsure if that dropped it all the way to a 3 stars, but like I said, I ended up deciding that it was going to stay 4 stars, just kind of like a lower 4-star book. Another thing that I really liked about this book was the way that it explored how people 20 years from an apocalyptic event would look back on things like the technology that we had, the words that we used to talk about technology, the idea of kids who grew up after the apocalypse happened, how they would understand or think about electricity or the internet or like the cloud. I just thought that was a really fascinating thing to explore in a post-apocalyptic book. In some ways, I feel like Station 11 has a little bit of a literary fiction pull to it. It's definitely a quiet book, a slower moving book. It's not at all like a action-packed post-apocalyptic book, which I knew going into it that it wasn't going to be that, and I wasn't expecting that. But it still just didn't give me the ending that I was wanting based on how I felt like things were tying together as we went along. The best way I can think to describe it is that through the book, I felt like the story was becoming this like really tangled web with these people who were connected in all these interesting ways, and I thought that it was going to lead to like this really big knot that was beautiful. I don't know if this is making sense, but at the end, that knot didn't become a knot, it just kind of fell apart. That is the best like analogy I can give for my experience and how the ending let me down. Alright guys, those are all 6 books that I read in the month of December. If you've read any of these books, let me know down in the comment section what you thought about them. I am brainstorming and getting ready to start filming all my end of year stuff. I am one of those people who refuses to film a year wrap-up sort of video until after the year is over, or at least until I know I'm not going to finish any more books, which is like now. I do kind of a lot of end-of-year videos, so they will be coming to you throughout January and through a good chunk of February, just because I have so many different ideas of things that I want to do. I think last year I did 6, and this year I might do 8. I just love making these videos and looking at my year as a whole and picking out different categories of books to talk about with you guys. If you guys have any requests of specific end of year videos that you'd like to see, definitely let me know down in the comment section. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. I post 1 to 2 times a week. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. But that you've only, and a lot of them you've only met in like in the very beginning, but those writing things got less, but those writing, I think I need to readjust my darkness level, because the, how do I say this? And yeah, it wasn't anything mind-blowing, but bye.